My driveway gate chained cold wind rasping and boots grinding gravel, while HOA cameras hovered by the fence. Trish Caldwell posted HOA access notice, waved the paper with trucks idling right behind her, and neighbors filming 3 feet from the gate like it was already law. That county plat map, its creased survey lines and file tab edge catching the light, rested in my hand like a question nobody wanted answered. Beside me, Talbot whispered. Finally, someone fought back.
The HOA treated it like a neighborhood route, but county records still marked a private farm driveway, and the access line was tied to a recorded agricultural easement.
I backed my pickup out before sunrise the same way I had every morning for 30 years. Same routine. Same quiet. The headlights swept across the farm gate. Then the truck stopped. Not because I hit the brakes, because something was sitting across the driveway. I leaned forward and squinted through the windshield. A mound of gravel, fresh, gray, damp, spread wide enough to block the entire entrance. Now what in the world? I killed the engine and stepped out. Cold air hit my face. My boots crunched on loose stones as I walked closer. The gravel pile stood waist-high and stretched from one fence post to the ditch on the other side. My gate couldn't even swing open. I stared at it a moment. Then I noticed something tapping against the mailbox. Click, click, click. A strip of laminated paper flapped in the wind. I walked over and pulled it loose. The plastic was cold in my hands. Big, bold letters ran across the top. HOA Access Improvement Notice. I read it once, then again, then a third time. My neighbor Talbot came walking down the road holding a coffee mug. "Morning, Hank." I held up the notice. "Talbot, you see this last night?" He squinted toward the gravel mound. "Hard to miss it. You watch them dump it," he nodded slowly. Truck rolled in close to midnight. "Midnight, yeah." He pointed down the road toward the subdivision. White pickup with that subdivision logo on the door. I looked back at the gravel pile. My jaw tightened. They say why Talbot shrugged. "Figured you ordered it." I gave a short laugh. A dry one. "No." The wind rattled the laminated notice again. Click. Click. Talbot stepped closer. "What's it say?" I read the line aloud. "Community Access Stabilization Project approved by HOA Board." Talbot blinked. "Access," I pointed toward the gravel. "Talbot, this is my driveway." He nodded. "Sure is." I shoved the notice into my jacket pocket. Well, Talbot took another sip of coffee. "What you gonna do?" I walked over and kicked the gravel mound. A few stones rolled down the side. The pile barely moved. "That's the problem." I pointed toward the pasture beyond the gate. "I've got tractors coming through here in an hour." Talbot glanced toward the subdivision road again. "You better move quick then." "Why?" He nodded toward the road. A car had slowed almost to a stop. Someone inside had their phone stuck out the window. Recording. Talbot lowered his voice. "Because the HOA folks are already watching." I looked back down at the laminated notice in my pocket. The gravel wasn't the worst part. The notice was. I pulled it out again. The bottom corner held a signature line. Trish Caldwell, ROA President. I exhaled slowly. "Well now." Talbot raised an eyebrow. "That name means something. It means trouble." He chuckled. "Yeah, I heard stories." I walked back toward the gravel mound and grabbed the shovel leaning against the fence. The metal blade scraped the driveway as I pushed it under the stones. figure I'll move enough to open the gate. Talbot leaned against the mailbox. You think they'll let you? I pushed another load of gravel aside. This is my driveway. The shovel bit into the mound again. Stone slid into the ditch. Another scrape. Another pile. The gravel barely shifted. Talbot tilted his head toward the road. You might want to look up. I turned. 2 SUVs from the subdivision were turning onto the road toward the farm. Slow, deliberate. Both windows already down. Phones pointed straight at the driveway. Recording. I rested the shovel on the gravel mound. Well. Talbot sighed. Looks like the show's starting. The SUVs rolled to a stop beside the ditch. Doors opened. People stepped out. One woman held her phone high. Another man pointed toward the gravel. Then someone called out across the driveway. Don't touch that gravel. The wind rattled the notice in my hand again. Click. Click. I looked at the gravel mound, then at the camera phones, then back at the signature on the paper. Trish Caldwell, HOA President. Talbot muttered quietly beside me. You gonna move it anyway? I gripped the shovel handle. The gravel pile wasn't just blocking my driveway anymore. It was blocking something bigger. And the people filming already knew it. The SUVs stopped beside the gravel pile. Engines idled for a second. Then the doors opened. Out stepped Trish Caldwell. I recognized her immediately. Everyone in the county knew who ran the subdivision HOA, and Trish ran it like a mayor with a clipboard. Calm voice, perfect smile, always acting like the rules belonged to her. She walked toward the gravel mound, slowly heels crunching on the stone. First she looked at the pile. Then she looked at me. Then she smiled. Morning, Hank. I folded my arms across my chest. Morning. She gestured casually toward the gravel mound, like she was unveiling a park bench. Nice improvement, right? I stared at her. Improvement for neighborhood access. I blinked once. This is my driveway. She tilted her head slightly. It's a shared path now, Talbot muttered beside me. That's new. Several HOA members stood behind her along the road. Phones up. Recording. One of them slowly circled the gravel pile with a camera like it was a tourist attraction. Trish ignored them. She reached into the folder tucked under her arm. Then she pulled out another laminated sheet. I watched her walk straight to my farm gate. The plastic notice slapped against the metal. Click. She smoothed it flat with her hand. The bold header read, HOA access route do not alter. The wind tugged at the bottom corner. Click. Click. I stepped closer. You voted on my driveway, Trish turned calmly. We voted on the path. There is no path. There is now. Talbot chuckled quietly behind me. Trish didn't even look at him. A phone camera moved closer. One of the HOA members leaned toward the gravel mound. Can you stand a little to the left, Trish? We're filming. She shifted half a step, still smiling. I pointed at the gravel pile. You're blocking my farm entrance. She shrugged. You can still drive over it. Not with a tractor. That's not our concern. The sentence hung in the air. A couple of HOA members murmured agreement behind her. One of them said quietly, It's for community safety. I looked back at the gravel mound, then at the gate, then at the laminated notice flapping beside it. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. Right then a truck rattled down the road behind us. I didn't even have to turn to know who it was. Earl's old pickup. The engine coughed as it rolled to a stop beside Talbot. Earl leaned halfway out the window. What did I miss? I pointed toward the gravel mound. They dumped gravel across my driveway. Earl climbed out slowly. He walked around the pile boots crunching the stones. Then he stopped and looked at Trish. Who did? I jerked my thumb toward her. Trish stepped forward smoothly. The HOA. Earl whistled softly. Well, he turned and looked at me. That's bold. Talbot chuckled. That's one word for it. Trish rested her hand lightly on my farm gate. We posted notice. I stepped closer. You posted it this morning. We posted it legally. Talbot snorted loudly. That paper doesn't make it legal. Trish ignored him. Her attention stayed on me. The wind rattled both laminated notices now. Click, click. The sound carried down the driveway like a metronome. Trish's voice stayed calm. If you remove the gravel, she paused just long enough for the phones to zoom in. The HOA will file a violation. Earl leaned toward me. You calling a lawyer yet? I didn't answer. I just watched Trish walk back toward her SUV. Phones tracked her every step. Someone whispered, "This is going to blow up online." Trish reached the driver's door. She turned back once. Her smile hadn't moved. Earl folded his arms beside me. You hearing this? I nodded slowly. Yeah. Violation notice. That's what she said. Earl looked down at the gravel pile again. Because if they're threatening violations, he kicked one loose stone into the ditch. This isn't over. The wind rustled the laminated papers again. Click, click. Trish opened the SUV door. But before she climbed inside, she turned and called out across the driveway. Her voice carried clearly to every phone camera pointed our way. We already scheduled the hearing.
At that point, the dispute moved out of roadside argument and into a formal review channel. A scheduled hearing does not decide ownership by itself, but it changes the pressure around the conflict because both sides now have to carry their claims into an administrative setting. That shift matters. An HOA can impose routine notice inside its own process. Yet, once a hearing is set, the burden starts drifting toward records, filings, and anything that can survive review beyond neighborhood habit. From there, informal certainty becomes harder to maintain without documented authority.
The road went quiet. Phones stayed raised. Talbot leaned toward me and whispered, Did she just say hearing I didn't take my eyes off the SUV? Yeah, she did. By mid-morning, I'd had enough. The gravel mound still sat across my driveway like a gray wall. The laminated HOA notice on the gate kept tapping in the wind. Click, click, click. Earl stood beside the fence post watching the road. I climbed onto the tractor seat. The engine turned once. Then it roared to life. The sound rolled across the fields. Earl looked up at me. You sure? I nodded. I'm moving the gravel. The loader bucket lowered slowly. Steel touched stone. Scrape. The sound cut through the quiet morning. The bucket slid under the edge of the pile. I lifted. A load of gravel rose into the air. For a second, nothing happened. Then phones appeared again. HOA members walking down the road from the subdivision. 3 of them, then 5, all holding their phones up, recording. One man stepped closer to the driveway and called out loudly, Tampering with HOA property. Earl turned toward him. That's rich. The man kept filming. Evidence, he said. I ignored them. The tractor engine hummed beneath me as I backed up. Then I tipped the bucket. Gravel spilled into the ditch beside the fence. Thud. Rattle. Slide. The first section of driveway opened. Not much, but enough to see dirt again. One of the HOA members lifted his phone higher. Live stream started. Another one said, "Yeah, people are joining." Earl leaned toward the closest camera. "You recording?" The man grinned. Transparency. Earl shook his head. "Sure it is." I pushed the tractor forward again. The bucket scraped under another section of gravel. Lift. Back up, dump. Stone rattled into the ditch. The live stream crowd behind the phones kept growing. Cars slowed on the road. Neighbors leaned out windows. Someone whispered, "That's the farmer." Another voice said, "This is the driveway dispute." I scooped another bucket. The engine growled. Gravel slid aside again. Then another truck rolled up. This one had a construction logo painted across the door. The driver parked beside the gravel mound and stepped out. He looked at the ditch, then at the pile, then at my tractor. His forehead wrinkled. That gravel already moved. Earl walked toward him. "You the one dumped it," the man nodded slowly. "Yeah." He pointed at the pile. "HOA job." Earl jerked his thumb toward me. "That man's driveway." The contractor blinked, confused. "Wait." He pointed at the gravel again. HOA said the subdivision owned the access. The words hung there in the air. Phones tilted closer, recording everything. I lowered the tractor bucket. Then I shut the engine off. The machine fell silent. The sudden quiet made the cameras feel louder somehow. Earl folded his arms. "Well, that's interesting." The contractor shifted awkwardly. "That's what the paperwork said." "Paperwork, yeah." He shrugged. "They said it was a community access route." One of the HOA members stepped closer. Still filming. "You're not allowed to alter HOA improvements." I walked toward the contractor, boots crunching the gravel. "You were told this road belonged to the HOA." He scratched the back of his neck. "That's what the work order said." Earl shook his head slowly. "Boy." He gestured toward the farm. "You see those fields?" The contractor nodded. "That land belongs to him." The man looked from Earl to me, then at the gravel, then at the cameras. "Look, I just run the truck." Cars kept slowing along the road. More neighbors watching now. Phones everywhere. Public. Someone whispered near the fence, "This is going viral." One of the HOA members laughed quietly. "Already is." I turned toward the cameras, toward the live stream phones, toward the people who thought they already knew the story. Good. The cameras moved closer. Someone asked loudly, "You admit you're removing HOA property?" I nodded once. Live streaming doesn't make a lie true. The live stream comments started flying across their screens. I could see the reflection in one phone. Thousands watching now. The contractor stepped back toward his truck. "This is getting weird." Earl laughed under his breath. "You have no idea." The wind rattled the laminated notice again. Click. Click. One of the HOA members stepped forward. He held his phone straight toward my face. You better stop. Why? Because the board already decided. He smiled like the ending was obvious. The hearing is tomorrow. The gravel pile sat between us, half moved, half blocking the driveway. And suddenly the whole county was watching to see who would win.
A board can act as if routine use created its own authority. But access claims usually weaken when they cannot be traced to a documented easement or some recorded support. Inside the land record system, that gap matters quickly because once pressure shifts from notice to proof, the next real question usually belongs to a county recorder review.
That evening, Claude spread the plat map across my kitchen table before I even sat down. Paper edges crackled under his hands. Earl leaned over the back of a chair, arms folded, watching Claude work, while the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and tractor grease. Claude traced a line with the tip of his pen. Black ink. Fields. Fence lines. Then the narrow strip of driveway that ran to the county road. You see this? He asked. I nodded. My driveway. Claude gave a slight smile. Recorded agricultural easement. Earl leaned closer. What does that mean in English? Claude tapped the line again. It means the county recognizes that road as farm access. His pen slid slowly along the easement. No HOA board can vote that away. Earl looked at me. So the gravel stunt is illegal, Claude nodded once. Looks that way. I leaned back in my chair and let the wood creak. Well, that's good news. Claude didn't answer. He kept staring at the map. The room went quiet, except for the refrigerator humming behind us and a truck passing out on the road. His pen moved again, slower this time, along the border where my land met the subdivision. Then he stopped. Wait. Earl straightened. What Claude didn't look up. He slid the pen along a hard black line. This fence here. The pen moved another inch. Doesn't match the county survey. I frowned. What does that mean? Claude turned the paper slightly, so the kitchen light hit it better. Then he traced the property line again with one finger and finally looked up. It means the subdivision fence might be inside your property. Earl blinked. Hold on. Claude nodded. If that fence was placed using the HOA's survey instead of the county's, he tapped the line again. They may have built it on Hank's land. The words settled over the table like dust. Earl looked at me, then back at Claude. You telling me that whole subdivision fence could be wrong? Claude shrugged lightly. It happens more than you'd think. I leaned forward again and stared at the map. The thin county line ran straight across the driveway. The subdivision fence line didn't. It sat several feet inside it. That fence is theirs, I said quietly. Claude shook his head. Maybe. Earl let out a low whistle. Well. He stepped back and rested against the counter. That's interesting. Claude folded one corner of the plat map back. Another document sat underneath. A printed HOA notice, the same kind they had taped to my gate. He slid it toward me. The header read, HOA access route do not alter. Claude tapped it once with his pen. This is their artifact. I nodded. They taped it to my gate. Good. He looked almost satisfied. Bring it tomorrow. Earl frowned. To the hearing, Claude nodded. Yes. Then he tapped the map again. Because paper beats opinion every time. That line sat there a second. Nobody answered it. I looked from the plat map to the HOA notice, then back to the map. The easement, the driveway, the fence, all of it in black ink. The gravel pile that had looked so big that morning suddenly felt smaller than the paperwork sitting on my table. Claude studied the border one more time. If the fence really sits inside your property. He folded the map carefully. The HOA has a bigger problem than gravel. Earl turned his head. You mean trespassing? Claude didn't answer right away. He slid the plat map into a folder, closed it, and pushed it across the table toward me. The cardboard edge scraped softly against the wood. That quiet sound said more than a speech would have. I picked the folder up. Bring this to the hearing tomorrow, Claude said. I nodded. Think it'll help? Claude smiled. More than help. Earl looked from him to me. You two sound real confident. Claude leaned back in his chair. I'm confident in documents. He tapped the folder once. Especially county records. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was slipping off the pasture. The farm had gone quiet. But tomorrow wouldn't. Claude stood and picked up his coat. He paused at the kitchen door. One more thing. I looked up. What? He rested a hand on the frame. The deputy will be there too. Earl straightened at once. Deputy Claude nodded. Public hearing with a property dispute. He opened the door. They like to keep things calm. Then he stepped out into the dark yard. The kitchen went quiet again. Earl kept staring at the folder in my hands. Then he looked at me. Well, Hank. He nodded toward the papers. Looks like tomorrow might get interesting. I opened the folder just enough to see the plat map again. The driveway, the easement, the fence line. Everything drawn in clean black ink. And for the first time since that gravel showed up across my gate, it looked like the HOA had made a bigger mistake than they realized. The next morning, the gravel pile was still sitting across my driveway. Gray. Silent. Stubborn. The sunrise stretched long shadows across the stones, but nothing about the scene had changed. Except one thing. A sheriff's cruiser sat beside the ditch. White doors, county badge, engine ticking softly as it cooled. The driver's door opened. Deputy Ramirez stepped out and shut it with a solid thunk. His radio gave a short beep on his shoulder. He looked around slowly. First at the gravel mound, then at my farm gate, then down the road toward the small crowd gathered along the shoulder. HOA members again. Phones out. Recording. Earl leaned toward me. Well, he nodded toward the cruiser. Showtime. The deputy walked toward the driveway without rushing. Boots crunching gravel. Each step slow and deliberate. The kind of walk a man uses when he knows everyone's watching. When he reached the mound, he crouched down, picked up a handful of gravel. The stones sifted through his fingers and fell back to the ground with a dry rattle. Then he stood and looked at the gate. The laminated notice taped to the metal fluttered in the wind. Click, click. Ramirez stepped closer and read it. HOA access route. Do not alter. The paper snapped once in the breeze. He stared at it for a moment. Then he turned toward the group standing along the road. His eyes stopped on Trish Caldwell. Morning, he said. I nodded. Morning, deputy. He gestured toward the gravel mound. This yours? No. Who put it here? I pointed toward Trish. The HOA. Phones lifted higher, zoom lenses sliding closer. Someone whispered from the roadside. This is the moment. Trish stepped forward immediately. Her voice calm, controlled. This was a community access stabilization. Ramirez tilted his head slightly. Across a private driveway, she opened the folder tucked under her arm. We have documentation. Claude stepped beside me quietly. He slid the plat map from the folder and handed it toward the deputy. County record, Claude said. Ramirez accepted the paper. He unfolded it slowly. The wind rustled the corners. Earl leaned close to me. Moment of truth. The deputy studied the plat map. Black survey lines, fence markers. Then the narrow strip labeled agricultural easement. His finger traced the driveway. Then he looked up. Back at the gravel mound. Back at the laminated notice. Then toward Trish. Behind her, the HOA group had gone silent. Phones still recording, but nobody talking. Ramirez lifted the map slightly. This shows the driveway as recorded agricultural access. Trish pulled a document from her folder. Our board approved a stabilization project. She handed the page toward him. The top line read, HOA Community Access Authorization. Ramirez took the paper, looked from one document to the other. Claude spoke quietly beside me. County record overrides HOA paperwork. The deputy didn't comment. He just kept studying the papers. The wind rattled the laminated notice again. Click, click. Someone behind the cameras whispered, "This is the hearing." Another live stream started. The little red recording light blinked. Earl shifted beside me. You nervous a little? Don't be. Ramirez folded the HOA document once, then handed it back to Trish. This says your board approved access improvements. Yes, she replied. But the plat map says the access belongs to him. Trish didn't answer that. The deputy glanced toward the contractor truck parked farther down the road. Same truck that had delivered the gravel. Ramirez nodded toward it. Who placed the gravel? Trish answered smoothly. The HOA contracted the work. Earl muttered beside me, well, that part's true. Ramirez nodded once. Then he stepped closer to the gravel mound again. Boot nudging a stone aside. He looked at the driveway, then at the gate, then at the laminated notice, then back at Trish. The silence stretched. Finally he spoke. Authority requires proof. Phones zoomed in again. Trish crossed her arms. We have board authority. Claude gestured toward the plat map. You have a vote. He tapped the county record gently. This is ownership. Ramirez looked down at the map again, then at the gravel mound blocking the driveway, then at the small crowd filming every second. Cars had slowed along the road. More neighbors now. Watching. Public. Earl leaned toward me again. They weren't expecting this. The deputy folded the plat map carefully, handed it back to Claude. Then he faced Trish. One simple question. Who authorized altering private access? The road went completely quiet. Wind rustled the papers. Click, click. Trish didn't answer. One HOA member glanced at another. Another lowered their phone. Recording stopped. Earl whispered under his breath. Well, that's interesting. Deputy Ramirez waited. Still. Patient. The kind of silence that gets heavier every second. Nobody answered. Not Trish. Not the board members. Not the people who had filmed the gravel being dumped. The deputy looked slowly across the group, then back at the gravel mound, then at my driveway. The stones sat there like evidence, a physical wall built by paperwork and bad assumptions. Ramirez spoke again. Quiet. Measured. If no one authorized it. He nodded toward the gravel pile. Then someone's responsible for putting it here. The phones didn't move. Nobody spoke. And suddenly, the gravel mound didn't look like an HOA project anymore. It looked like a mistake, a very public one. The county hearing room was already half full when I arrived. Metal chairs scraped against the tile floor as people shifted to see who was walking in. Someone coughed near the back wall. A pair of residents whispered quietly while looking toward the front table. The air smelled faintly like coffee and printer paper. I paused at the doorway for a moment. County hearings never looked dramatic from the outside. Just fluorescent lights, white walls, a long table with microphones. But that morning the room felt different. Every seat seemed pointed toward one thing: the dispute over a pile of gravel sitting across my driveway. Behind me, the door closed with a soft door chime sound. The quiet bell echoed lightly through the room. Claude walked beside me carrying one slim folder. Earl leaned close as we took our seats. He glanced across the room, then he grinned. "That's a confidence ratio I like." I followed his eyes. Trish Caldwell had just walked in. She carried 3 thick binders stacked under one arm, tabs sticking out, paper labels everywhere. She placed them on the table with a firm thud. Claude set his single folder down beside me. Earl chuckled under his breath. 3 binders versus 1 folder. He leaned closer. I know which side I'm betting on. The hearing officer entered from the side door a moment later. Gray hair, thin glasses, a careful expression that suggested he had seen every kind of argument before. He sat down at the center desk and adjusted his microphone. Paper shuffled. Someone near the back whispered, "That's the farmer." The officer adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. "Let's begin." The quiet settled quickly. Trish stood first. She opened one of her binders and flipped to a tab. Her voice came out steady. The Homeowners Association approved an access stabilization project. She slid several photos across the desk. Pictures of the gravel mound, pictures of the driveway entrance, pictures clearly taken from the road. Our goal, she continued, was to improve neighborhood walking safety. The hearing officer studied the photographs briefly. He turned one slightly, then another. Behind me, someone shifted in their chair. The room stayed quiet. Claude didn't move. He simply waited. Trish continued. The road has long served as a walking route between subdivision streets. She gestured toward one of the pictures. The HOA board voted to stabilize the access point. The officer looked up. And the stabilization involved dumping gravel across the entrance, Trish answered smoothly. Across the access path. A few residents murmured quietly. Earl leaned toward me and whispered, "She really likes that word." Claude still hadn't spoken. The officer turned his head toward our side of the table. "Mr. Turner." Claude stood. He lifted the folder and opened it carefully. Then he placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. The plat map slid across the surface with a soft shh sound. "This driveway," Claude said calmly, "is a recorded agricultural easement." The officer leaned forward slightly. Claude continued. "The easement provides farm equipment access from Mr. Turner's property to the county road." He tapped the map once. "The Homeowners Association has no authority to alter it." The officer studied the map carefully. Lines, boundary numbers, survey marks. Deputy Ramirez stepped forward from the side of the room. The officer looked toward him. Deputy Ramirez nodded once. When I arrived yesterday morning, he said the gravel pile blocked the entrance. He gestured toward the map. Farm equipment could not pass. The officer nodded slowly. Trish flipped open another binder. Pages turned quickly. Paper sliding. Tabs snapping. She scanned the documents and pulled one sheet free. Our board authorization is here. She handed it forward. The officer accepted the paper. He read the title, HOA Community Access Authorization. Then he looked back at the plat map, then back at the authorization form. The room grew quiet again. Trish opened another binder quickly, pages flipping. She searched through another section, then another. But none of the documents showed ownership of the driveway. Claude remained standing, waiting. The officer adjusted his glasses again. Ms. Caldwell, he said carefully. Yes. Do you have documentation showing the association owns the access road? Trish paused. She turned another page in the binder, then another. The pages moved faster now, paper sliding, tabs bending, but nothing appeared. Behind me, Earl whispered softly, "That's not the sound of winning." Claude tapped the plat map again. Just once. The small tap echoed louder than it should have. "A vote can't erase a deed," he said calmly. The hearing room fell completely silent. The officer looked down at the map again. Then he cleared his throat. "The driveway is private property." A murmur moved through the room. Someone in the back whispered, "So the HOA can't block it," the officer continued. "The agricultural easement remains valid under county record." Trish flipped one last binder page, then another. Her hands slowed. The silence stretched. The officer folded his hands on the desk. Therefore, the Homeowners Association had no authority to place material across the entrance. Earl leaned back in his chair. His grin returned slowly. The officer continued speaking. "The gravel must be removed." Another quiet wave of whispers moved through the hearing room. Phones lifted again. Recording resumed. I looked down at the plat map sitting on the desk. The black line marking the driveway looked simple, just ink on paper. But that ink had just beaten 3 binders of HOA paperwork. The officer adjusted the map slightly. Then his eyes moved to another section of the survey. His finger traced a boundary line. Then he looked up again. "And we also need to discuss the subdivision fence." The room went quiet again. Claude didn't move. But Earl leaned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, this is getting good." 3 days later, the survey trucks arrived. The sound reached the farm before the vehicles did, metal rods clinking together in the back of the truck. Click, click. Orange stakes were stacked neatly along the truck bed, bright enough to be seen from halfway across the pasture. Word had spread. Neighbors were already gathered along the fence line between my farm and the subdivision. Some leaned against their trucks. Others stood with their arms folded. Phones appeared again. Recording. The gravel pile across my driveway had already been removed after the hearing ruling. But the argument hadn't ended. If anything, it had only gotten bigger. Because the hearing officer had mentioned one thing that nobody expected. The fence. Claude stood beside me watching the survey crew unload their equipment. Tripods, laser levels, long measuring tapes. The lead surveyor nodded toward the subdivision fence stretching across the field. "That the line in question?" Claude nodded calmly. "That's the one." The crew got to work immediately. Tape stretched across the grass. Metal rods slid into the ground. Numbers called quietly between the workers. The sound of measuring tape sliding through the air echoed across the field. The subdivision fence sat there in silence. White wood, fresh paint, installed years ago when the neighborhood was first built. People had always assumed it was in the right place, until someone actually looked at the map. Claude stood with his hands behind his back, watching every movement of the instruments. Earl leaned toward me. "You nervous a little?" "Don't be." He nodded toward the survey crew. "Math is on your side today." The lead surveyor crouched beside one of the instruments and checked the digital reading. Then he stood and looked down the line of the fence. He raised one hand. "Mark here." A worker stepped forward carrying the first orange stake. He pushed the metal rod into the ground. The hammer struck once, then twice. The bright marker stood upright in the grass. But it wasn't where the fence stood. It was several feet inside it. Earl blinked slowly. "Well, I'll be." The neighbors along the road began whispering. Phones lifted higher, recording. The survey crew continued measuring. Another point, another hulculation, another orange stake. The second marker landed even deeper inside the subdivision fence line. The murmuring grew louder. One woman near the road said quietly, "That can't be right." Claude didn't react. He simply watched the instruments. Another worker called out a number. The lead surveyor nodded. "Mark the next point." A third orange stake went into the soil, then a fourth, each one forming a straight line across the field, each one sitting several feet inside the fence. The bright markers created a new boundary, one that didn't match the wooden fence at all. Earl rubbed the back of his neck. "Claude, that fence is wrong." Claude nodded slightly. "Yes." The crowd along the road shifted closer. Phones everywhere now. Recording. The subdivision gate opened and several HOA board members walked down the path toward the field. Trish Caldwell stepped out front. Her expression looked tighter than usual. She stopped when she saw the first line of orange stakes. "What is this?" Claude answered calmly. "A survey." She gestured toward the fence. "That fence marks the subdivision boundary." The lead surveyor shook his head gently. "No, ma'am." He pointed toward the orange stakes. "These do." A ripple moved through the crowd. People leaned forward to look. Some walked along the line of markers, counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each one sitting firmly inside the fence. Claude stepped forward slightly. The county plat map placed the property line here. He gestured toward the row of orange stakes. "The fence crosses into Mr. Turner's property." Phones lifted even higher, recording every word. Trish stared at the stakes, then at the fence, then at Claude. "That's impossible." Claude said nothing. He simply nodded toward the survey crew. The lead surveyor checked his instrument again. Then he looked up. "The line is confirmed." The crowd murmured louder now. One neighbor whispered, "The HOA built their fence on his land." Another voice answered, "That's not a small mistake." Earl folded his arms. "You could say that again." Another survey marker went into the soil. The line of orange stakes now stretched across the field like a row of warning lights. The subdivision fence stood crooked beside them. Suddenly it looked very temporary. Trish's face tightened. She turned toward the other HOA board members. One of them stepped forward slowly. A tall man wearing a subdivision logo jacket. He looked at the stakes, then at the fence, then back at Trish. This wasn't in the bylaws. The words hung in the air. Phones zoomed closer. Another board member stepped beside him. You said the boundary was verified. Trish didn't answer. The survey crew continued quietly placing markers. Hammer strikes echoed softly across the field. Clang. Clang. Another stake went in. Then another. Each one confirming the same thing. The fence didn't belong where it stood. Claude looked calmly along the line of markers. Then he spoke. The map doesn't care who's loudest. The statement carried across the crowd. A few people laughed quietly. Others nodded. Trish stared at the survey stakes again. Her binders weren't with her today. No paperwork, no printed notices. Just the fence. And the orange stakes proving it was wrong. Arguments started spreading through the HOA group. One member spoke sharply. You told us the boundary was correct. Another answered. We approved the gravel because you said the path belonged to us. The voices grew louder. The neighbors watched, recording everything. Earl leaned toward me. Well, he nodded toward the arguing board members. That escalated fast. Another HOA member stepped forward slowly. He looked at the survey stakes, then at Trish. His voice was quieter than the others, but the words carried clearly. We need new leadership. The crowd went silent again. The row of orange stakes stretched across the grass. Bright, straight, unmistakable. The fence beside them suddenly looked like a mistake that had been waiting years to be discovered.
Boundaries in property disputes do not rely on what people remember. They depend on what the land records actually recognize as the controlling line, and that rule quietly limits any fence built on assumption. Once a survey reveals a conflict between placement and the official registry, the dispute typically shifts into a closer check inside the property record system.
2 weeks later, the gravel pile was gone. Workers had cleared every last stone from the driveway, not just pushed aside, removed. The ditch had been cleaned, the road leveled again. Even the tire ruts had been smoothed out where the dump truck had backed in that night. For the first time since the mess began, the driveway looked the way it had looked for decades. Simple. Quiet. Mine. My gate swung open again, just like it had every morning for 30 years. The hinges gave the same old creak they always had. The sound echoed across the pasture in the early sunlight. A familiar sound. The kind you don't notice until it disappears. The morning air smelled like cut grass and warm dirt. No gravel dust. No arguments. Just farmland waking up the way it was supposed to. Earl leaned against the fence post watching the road. His truck sat nearby with the driver's door open. Coffee cup balanced on the hood. Well, he said. He nodded toward the subdivision in the distance. That HOA meeting must have been interesting. I chuckled quietly. From what Claude told me, I looked down the driveway again. Very interesting. The board had replaced Trish Caldwell within the week. Apparently, the survey stakes had done something 3 binders and a gravel pile couldn't. They made the truth visible. And when neighbors can see the truth with their own eyes, it becomes harder to argue, especially when it's painted bright orange across a field. Earl kicked a loose pebble toward the ditch. Fence crew came yesterday. I saw. The subdivision fence had been moved back to the correct line. Board by board, post by post. The old holes filled. The new ones drilled exactly where the survey stakes had stood. For the first time since the neighborhood was built, the fence actually matched the county map. Claude had stopped by after the work finished. He stood beside the new fence line with his hands in his pockets. "Boundary restored," he had said calmly. Then he nodded once. Problem solved. That was Claude's way. 3 words. End of argument. Earl took a sip of his coffee. No more notices. None. No more cameras. None. He nodded toward the empty road. Peaceful again. And it was. The HOA trucks hadn't come back. No laminated warnings flapping in the wind. No live stream phones waiting for a fight. Just quiet farmland again. Exactly the way it should have been the whole time. A truck drove past on the county road and slowed slightly. The driver waved. Word had traveled faster than I expected. People in town had followed the hearing, followed the survey, followed the arguments that spilled out across the fence line, and they had watched the ending. A few neighbors had even stopped by during the fence move just to see the stakes themselves. Earl had enjoyed explaining it to them, usually with dramatic hand gestures. Survey doesn't care about HOA votes, he kept saying. Claude preferred a simpler version. County records win. That was the short explanation. The real one was even simpler. Maps matter, facts matter, and sometimes the quietest evidence carries the most weight. Earl pushed himself off the fence post and walked toward the mailbox. "Hey." He pointed down. "You seen this?" I walked over. A small sign had appeared beside the mailbox. Clean white metal, black lettering, fresh screws holding it to the post. Earl leaned closer and read it out loud. Private farm access. He straightened and grinned. About time. I nodded slowly. The new HOA board had installed it themselves. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a sign placed quietly where the trouble had started. Earl tapped the edge of it with his knuckle. Funny thing, what this sign probably would have solved the whole mess. Maybe. Instead, we got gravel, and a hearing, and a survey crew. I looked down the driveway toward the fields. 30 years of tractors had worn that path into the land. The dirt had packed hard from tires and seasons and work. My father had driven it. My grandfather before him. Every harvest had started there. Every planting season, too. Land remembers those things, even if people forget. Earl nudged my shoulder. "You gonna say it?" I glanced at him. "Say what?" He nodded toward the sign beside the mailbox. The lesson. The morning sun stretched across the driveway. The open gate cast a long shadow toward the road. Beyond it, the fields waited the way they always had. Work to do, crops to grow. Nothing about the land had changed, only the people arguing over it. I looked down the road toward the subdivision one last time. Quiet houses, fresh fence line, no cameras, no binders, just distance. Then I looked back at the sign, Private Farm Access. I smiled slightly. Know your land. Earl nodded. Simple. Most things are. He climbed back toward his truck. The door creaked open. Before getting in, he looked back at the driveway again. You know something? What you didn't just win that fight. I raised an eyebrow. No. He nodded toward the fence line. You reminded them where the line is. The engine of his truck started, a low rumble rolling across the pasture. He gave me a small wave through the window. Then he drove off down the road. The dust settled slowly behind him. I stood beside the gate a moment longer. The hinges creaked softly in the breeze. The sign beside the mailbox caught the morning sun. Private farm access. The driveway stretched into the fields the way it always had. And for the first time since the gravel showed up, everything was quiet again. Morning sunlight rested on the open gate and the small sign beside the mailbox that read Private Farm Access. The hearing transcript confirmed the easement, and the county survey stakes still lined the grass, where the true boundary had quietly stood long before the arguments began. A community finally saw that rules mean little without proof, and that respect for land builds stronger neighborhoods than any vote ever could. Justice isn't loud, it's steady. Finally, someone fought back, not with anger, but with records, witnesses, and the patience to let the truth stand. And if this story means anything, it's this: when the line is clear and the record is real, the strongest defense is simply knowing where your ground begins.
Situations like this usually start with an assumption that nobody stopped to test. Over time, repeated behavior can begin to look like authority, especially when a group is using to be obeyed. The property conflict rarely turn on confidence alone. They turn on the difference between neighborhood routine and recorded access, between what people believe and what record system can actually support. That is where the dispute usually expose the real risk. One of them starts acting like ownership. Ordinary boundaries become vulnerable. In the end, institution process tend to do what memory and pressure cannot. It puts the line back where it was supposed to be.